Quite a few years ago, there was a best-selling book by the Reverend Rick Warren called The Purpose-Driven Life. And I think what's kind of emerging, particularly among the generation that's sort of, say, between the ages of 18 and 30, is that they're living the perfection-driven life. Not all of them, but that quest for perfection, that idea that your life could be a little bit better. You could be a little bit better. You could look a little bit better. Why aren't you on the beach that you saw somebody you know sitting on Instagram? What are your board scores? What are your postgraduate plans? It's not an easy world to live in when perfectionism is the ideal. And today we're going to talk about ways in which perfectionism is the curse.
The following program was previously recorded.
Kids, I don't know what's wrong with these kids today. Kids who can understand anything they say. Kids, they are disobedient, disrespectful oafs, noisy, crazy, sloppy, lazy loafers. And while we're on the subject, kids, you can talk and talk till your face is blue. Kids, but they still do just what they want to do. Why can't they be like we were, perfect in every way? What's the matter with kids today?
All right, so why can't they be like we were, perfect in every way? We're going to talk about perfectionism on the show today and where it comes from and why it might be, well, it is, I think, almost empirically at this point, an enhanced problem in the younger generation. So, as some of you know, I am teaching a course at Yale. It's a seminar, 15 students. So if you want to talk about a group of people who probably have been driven by notions of perfection, this is, kind of ground zero here with them. And so I had to have the talk about grades. And so I just – and you just have no idea, if you're not dealing with it in real time right now, what this is like these days. And so the first thing I said is, look, if there's some kind of grade you really feel you have to have, just tell me, okay, and we'll try to figure it out. So I'm not here to make your life miserable. Don't tell anybody, like at the dean's office, that I said that. So, my thought is, if there's some way that I can give you that grade, I'll just do it rather than have you psychologically collapse. But then I told them a story. So, because I went to this same fine institution, and I said, when I was here in the 1970s, I said, I wasn't very grade focused, and it could be argued that I did not make the most of my 4 years at Yale. And I really didn't think too much about grades at all. I'd grown up in a very perfectionist household where my parents were very perfectionist about me, but I was liberated from them at this point. So I just did whatever I was curious about. And so in the fall of my senior year, I'm sitting at a dining table in Davenport College with several of my friends, and somehow or other this all comes up. One of these two friends was on the verge of graduating Phi Beta Kappa and summa cum laude. But the question is, how would I graduate? And so these two guys, Mark and Scott, they said, give us all your grades. Tell us all the grades that you've gotten in the past 3 years, which for some reason I knew. So I recited them all. They wrote them down on a paper placemat. No smartphones at this time. But I think somebody had a calculator. And so they did a little thing and they put their heads together. And then they looked up at me and they said, if you can get an A in every single course in both semesters of your senior year, you will just squeak into cum laude. You will just make it to cum laude. So I did it. And then it just didn't matter, And that's what I was telling my students. I said, it just didn't matter. I'm 67 years old right now. It has never mattered that I graduated cum laude. In fact, if you want to get punched in the face, probably a good thing to say to people would be, I graduated cum laude from Yale. But anyway, I was sort of telling them the story. And they're all wearing masks, so I can't really tell how it's landing. But I'm sensing probably the temperature in the room is, okay, that's your journey. That was your journey. We're on a different journey. tell us whether we're getting an A or not. So there are people who know so much more about this right now who are with us, and I'm excited, including a fellow member of the Yale faculty, actually the Dean of Faculty of Arts and Sciences. I probably already am getting written up about this. But joining us here for the first segment, Thomas Curran is an assistant professor of psychological and behavioral science at the London School of Economics and Political Science, who studies perfectionism, has given TED Talks about it, stuff like that. Tamar Gendler is a professor of philosophy, psychology, and cognitive science, and the dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Yale University. So, Thomas Curran, let's begin with what you see. You've done massive amounts of studies and meta-analysis, and it seems like all the indices really do point to the idea that there's a rise in perfectionism. Not perfectionism as maybe a worthy goal, but perfectionism as a burden. So talk a little bit about that.
So there's several ways we measure perfectionism in the academic literature. Broadly, it's a personality characteristic which I guess starts from a deficit thinking. So I'm not good enough, I'm not perfect enough, or I'm inherently flawed in some way. And from there, we see it expressed in several different ways. So the first way we see it expressed is self-oriented perfectionism. So that's perfectionism comes from within. I need to be perfect. I need to perfect my life and my lifestyle. The second is socially prescribed perfectionism. So this is the sense that other people and the world around me expects me to be perfect. And the third is other-oriented perfectionism. So this is sort of perfectionism turned outwards on others. So I expect you to be perfect. And those are the three types of perfectionism we tend to see in clinical settings and also in research settings. And we've done a lot of research to suggest that each of those elements of perfectionism are increasing among young people.
And there are a number of possible culprits as to why it would be increasing. One hates to blame everything on social media, but I do think so. One of the things social media does is set up a kind of feedback cycle of, this is my perfect life. How is your perfect life going? Are you standing on as nice a beach as I'm standing on right now? Look at me on Instagram. Are you having this terrific experience that I'm having right now? I mean, if you wanted a chance to quietly develop a sense of self and a sense of self-worth, you might be living in the wrong era, right?
Yeah, social media undoubtedly has a big role to play. It's by far the most popular of the smartphone apps, and billions of young people are on it every day. And of course, we feel compelled, really, don't we, to be visible, to be always online. And of course, the algorithms themselves sort of encourage that social comparison, upward comparison in particular, because it's the age-old advertising tactic, right? You get at people, you put them in a jar, you shake them around vigorously, and then you open the lid in a department store, basically, and you get people spending lots of money. So social media, because of the way it's engineered, because of the way it's structured, and just as you said, because of the way it encourages us to compare with each other, is certainly a factor when it comes to perfectionism.
So let's see what the wisdom of the ages has to say about all this, what the Western philosophical tradition has to say about this. We have Tamar Gendler with us, as I said. So I assume where we're going to go back to, where we're going to begin, is with Plato and Aristotle, and probably especially Aristotle, if we're talking about real-world perfection. So, Tamar Gendler, tell us a little bit about where we do begin.
Good, thank you. We do actually begin with Plato and Aristotle, philosophers who lived about 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece. And in both the case of Plato and the case of Aristotle, there is a notion of perfection as completion, as achieving something which is the goal of that particular entity. And Plato had the idea that the only things that were perfect were abstract things, like numbers, and that everything else was an incomplete approximation of perfection. You're correct that Aristotle had a notion of perfection as something possible for earthly things. But ironically, what perfection involved was coming to completion, not an endless fussing or fiddling along the way, but coming to complete conclusion.
I was a terrible philosophy student at Yale, so pardon me for this. My sense is that with Aristotle, he does direct us towards the area of our life where we can kind of realistically pursue perfection. If you're good at this, if you're good enough to maybe do this, that's where you should be kind of within the polis. You can serve the polis best if you kind of go after the thing that you're most likely to be perfect at. Am I even remotely close to the truth there?
You are, and in fact, that idea is already in Plato, the idea that there are certain things at which you have the potential for excellence. And so you see that in Plato's picture of what the ideal society looks like, and in Aristotle's picture that the human good is the pursuit of virtue, the pursuit of excellence. And you get 2,000 years later, in the writings of the philosopher Immanuel Kant, the idea that it is in fact your moral obligation to cultivate the ways in which you are excellent. That part of what morality requires is a focusing on what it is that you have been distinctively gifted with and how it is that you can realize those gifts.
Of course, Kant led a very circumscribed life. I sort of wonder if he's a good source of wisdom about how to live and be happy. But one thing I wanted to ask you about, and you're very, very aware of this, that at both Harvard and Yale, and I'm sure at a lot of other distinguished universities, there are these very popular kind of almost oversubscribed courses on happiness. And I wonder about that. I wonder whether these incredibly high-achieving students have been so driven by the furies of perfectionism that now they think that the way to deal with this is to take a course on happiness and do well at that, because this kind of striving for perfection, Tamar, has kind of driven out or excluded the possibility of pursuing some kind of normal happiness. You deal with a lot more students than I do. I'm wondering what you see there.
So I think you're correct that those courses on happiness are enormously popular on lots of campuses. But I think what students end up learning in them is the importance of grace and gratitude and self-forgiveness. So it may be that they enter with the expectation that this is a place where they can perfect their happiness and well-being, and come away with the recognition that the way to get inner harmony actually involves a kind of receptivity to the world, an acknowledgement of its challenges, and a readiness to forgive oneself, even if you're striving for it, for not achieving a particular goal.
Well, I hope so much that they are getting all that. So, Thomas, Curran, we're talking about Plato and Aristotle. The classical model that you invoke is not a philosopher but a myth, the myth of Sisyphus. Tell us what this has to do with perfectionism.
So this is such an interesting chat because I don't have a background in philosophy, but that concept of completion that Tamar talked about there is really fascinating to me, and I'm glad you brought up that tale, because one of the things about perfectionism that we see all the time is that they really struggle under situations of failure. So they feel every bump in the road because they need to be perfect, but also even under situations of success. They never feel enough because you can never be enough. And this idea, this myth around Sisyphus constantly rolling a rock up a hill for eternity as punishment. It's really this idea that success is sort of like a bottomless pit for the perfectionist. It depletes us as we try to reach it, and it's a bit like the horizon. Really, it moves further away as we get closer, and really that's why perfectionism is so really problematic, particularly for young people, because there's this sense of never enough, and if we don't feel like we can ever really be the perfect person that we idolize in our mind's eye, then that leads to a lot of negative emotions and feelings about ourselves. And a sense of, life is hopeless. And that's unfortunately why we start to see things linked with perfectionism and things like thoughts of suicide. So it's a really interesting conversation to bring in the philosophical side of this debate. And that's something we see a lot.
Yeah, I do want to say that this is closely linked with suicide. And if you or someone you know is having suicidal thoughts, call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline at 1-800-273-8255. That's 1-800-273-TALK. I get very nervous talking to young people who are driven by all that. And I wonder, Thomas, what kind of message comes? You talked about socially prescribed perfectionism, and some of that comes socially, as in from peer contact and kind of messages from family, community, friends. But I think about the culture too. And I think it's not an accident that the two most popular Olympic sports right now are gymnastics and figure skating. These are both sports where there is, in fact, kind of an ideal score. You are measured by how far short of that ideal score you fall, and that involves eliminating all kinds of little teeny tiny errors that would be almost indistinguishable or undetectable by the normal person's eye. And there's, I wonder if we and I should also say these two sports are also highly associated with dysfunction, with eating disorders and depression, and I mean everything that it takes to produce a Simone Biles we now know, the dark side behind all of that. And I wonder about that. I wonder why it is that we like watching television and watching these people who have put themselves in this really kind of ultra perfectionistic mode in order to win.
I just think that's the way culture is, and I think actually it's interesting. You bring up Biles, and you can give other high-profile examples like Naomi Osaka. These are athletes who, for the first time, and this is an astonishingly brave thing to do, has said enough's enough. That it's not worth my mental health to succeed when all around me and everything that's occurring is making me miserable. And I think that really is a watershed moment in a lot of ways, and not just for elite sports and the kind of marginal gains mindset that elite sport operates in. It doesn't matter about the welfare; it's about getting the tiniest minutiae of the extra additional percent to get us over the line. And I do think that that's really interesting, and there's a lot of lessons we can learn as a general society too from those examples, because we are seeing unprecedented pressures on young people these days. You can look in social media that we've just discussed. You can look in school at the amount of standardized tests that they're given. You could look at the college where the competitiveness for college places, particularly in the US, is just insane. And then in the workplace, as they progress into the workplace, where we've got a very tight labor market, particularly at the upper echelons of the income scale, and it's really, really tough to get on and progress. So I think it's not, sport is a really interesting microcosm of broader society. And I do hear a lot of young people doing exactly the same as those athletes are saying, you know what, we need to slow down, not speed up.
So, Tamar, last spring, when I talked to my Yale students about grades, maybe with 4 weeks to go in the term, I would say to a student, as things stand, you're kind of on track for an A-. I'm sure you've encountered this too. Almost reflexively, they say, well, what would it take for me to get an A? And that brings up the question of decreasing marginal utility. This is actually an economics term, but you think it also applies to some of these human perfection-oriented impulses.
Absolutely. So in some ways, the myth that Thomas adduced for us, which is this story of Sisyphus who's trying to get a rock all the way up the mountain and it rolls back down, is what it's like to try to achieve something that is perfect in a world that is destined for imperfection. And so much of what is valuable about an exercise can be achieved in doing a very, very, very good job at it. But the idea that there is a thing that is supposed to be, and your insight that we're obsessed with sports that have a notion of a perfect 10, the idea that there's a thing that it's supposed to be will inevitably introduce a sense of inadequacy. And there's a philosophical outlook called existentialism, which encourages you instead to look at the process rather than the outcome. And I know in your teaching, and certainly in my teaching, try to help students focus on what it is that they are learning at each moment, not what it is that the evaluation of their work will suggest they accomplished.
Yeah, I try to start some of my sentences. I will be so happy if you emerge from this course with the following, kinds of insights or ways of thinking about things. But I'm not sure I'm necessarily reaching them. Let me just ask you one final thing about all this. So in the world of psychiatry, Donald Winnicott in the mid-1950s, a British psychiatrist, came up with this model of the good enough mother that then got turned into the good enough parent. And that notion of good enough was really kind of transformative. Winnicott is still invoked in that context, that you being good enough. It's like being Sisyphus and getting within 1 foot of the top. It's sort of better than getting all the way to the top and having the rock roll down. You got a much bigger distance to travel the next time. I'm wondering, is there anybody we can point to in the Western philosophical tradition who does that good enough thing in a way that provides some relief from the phenomenon we're discussing?
It's a beautiful idea, and you rightly point out that it's central to psychology, the idea of secure attachment theory, which says you love unqualifiedly the person whom you are connected to, whether or not they are imperfect. And we have lots of great books courses here at Yale. A group of humanities faculty got together and they have a series of courses that are called 6 Pretty Good Books. So they are basically a Winnicott approach that says there is great value to being very good and then devoting the remainder of your time to doing something else very good, to connect back to the idea of diminishing marginal utility. There's great joy in perfecting something as long as you are taking joy in the process of perfection, and great disbenefit in spending obsessive time bringing something to completion that is no longer bringing you joy. And that is absolutely a central theme in the critics of almost all of the major philosophical perfectionists.
All right, so we have to take a break here. Thanks so much to Tamar Gendler. Let's make a habit of this. I'd love to talk to you some more times. Professor of Philosophy, Psychology, and Cognitive Sciences, and the Dean of Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Yale University. Thanks for being with us. We know we're not perfect on this show, but we are actually going to ask you during this pledge break to make a few contributions, make a few pledges to support the kind of work that we're doing here. It doesn't feel like work when we do it. It feels like play.
Special wings, so far to go from so far below.
All right, we're back. We're talking about perfectionism. We're talking about it not, for the most part, as a good thing, although there's a place for perfectionism, and maybe we'll have time to talk about that, too. Thomas Curran, Assistant Professor of Psychological and Behavioral Science at the London School of Economics and Political Science, studies perfectionism. Before we get back into Thomas, I know this is a clip he will identify with you with. He actually cites it also in some of his lectures. This is the author, Elizabeth Gilbert, talking about perfectionism in an interview with Hannah McGinnis.
I think that a lot of perfectionists, including myself, we use that word because we pretend it's a fault. It's what you say in a job interview, right? If anything, I'm too much of a perfectionist. I care too much, You actually secretly think it's a virtue. And so the trick is to actually expose it, to pull off its fake mask, and to expose perfectionism and call it by its real name, which is fear. That's all it is. It's fear. It's fear that you're not good enough. It's fear that you're not worthy. It's fear that you're going to be revealed, uncovered, exposed, betrayed, criticized, all of it. And so you're trying to mask that absolute terror by never making a misstep. And I feel like when I call my perfectionism fear, it's easier to actually make it go away, because that's not as sexy and it doesn't sound as fancy. I always say that perfectionism is just fear in high heels and a mink coat.
All right. Great image. Thomas Curran, would you agree with the bulk of that?
Every single word. It's absolutely right. And I think, fear, is one way to look at it. One of the things that I try to when I speak to young people is to try to get them to think about perfectionism in almost a similar way, but around our tolerance of imperfection. So instead of thinking about perfection as the things that we strive for, it's much more, as I mentioned earlier, a sort of deficit type of thinking. It's worries about what we lack and where we're deficient or flawed. And so if you look at perfectionism through that end of the telescope, trying to understand how perfectionistic somebody is really a case of trying to understand how tolerant are they of imperfection. And you have some people that are very tolerant of imperfection, and you have some people that are really intolerant of imperfection. And most of us are around the middle. But everything that was mentioned there was exactly right. And I think for your listeners, that's a really good place to start. When you talk about perfection, when you think about perfection, because then it becomes a lot easier to grasp why it's something problematic.
So, it's kind of interesting because two streaming television series, The Dropout and Inventing Anna, these are both based on real life people. Elizabeth Holmes, of course, is the one who's probably better known. But these are both about young women who, in fact, have subscribed so thoroughly to that notion of perfection and the notion of this life that needs to be achieved, that a life of money and attainment and accomplishment and prestige and status are kind of essential for their happiness. And it's so impossible to do, so impossible to achieve that they are driven instead into sociopathy. They wind up cutting all kinds of corners and doing all kinds of weird things. And you'd hope that would be an interesting object lesson. But Thomas, I'm thinking that's not actually how we address the problem. I don't know how we do. We ultimately do want to send a different set of messages, particularly to people maybe in their teens and 20s. How do we do that?
And I think the main thing and the most important thing is to let young people know at every single turn that they matter. The world radiates indifference, whether it be, I don't know, in the outcomes of zero-sum competition in the workplace or in education. We're told constantly that we only really matter when we've done something well, when we've achieved, or when we've received likes or shares or mentions, going back to social media. And I think there needs to be a key, there needs to be a reminder all the time that young people matter. Just to exist is to matter, and it's an astonishing miracle of life. And to be able to enjoy and accept ourselves for who we are, I think that for me is the most fundamental shift in perspective that we require. Because you're absolutely right; those programs expose a very commodified, consumeristic, I guess the perfectionistic fantasies of consumer and a consumer culture. Those are the things that we value more than ourselves. And so for me, that's the most important thing.
I think another part of this is, well, first of all, I think another part of that is imposter syndrome, too. Once you commit yourself to a completely unrealistic and unattainable goal, perfectionism, you sooner or later are going to become consciously or unconsciously aware that you're not getting there, at which point I think imposter syndrome takes over, that this kind of sense that if anybody knew how underachieving I am, how devaluable I really am, things would be considerably worse than they already are. But I wonder if the other problem is we don't teach people how to fail. To me, one of the most useful things that happened to me, and happened to me rather late in life in 2008, was I got fired. I got fired from a different radio show. And you know what? I was fine. I was fine. It would have been probably the thing I dreaded all my life, but it really was one of the better things that happened to me because I learned, oh, okay, I got fired. I don't know, I got a little bit more time to garden for a few months, and then I was fine and I got on with things. I don't think that's ever taught. I could be wrong.
I see this all the time in young people who I mentor, and it's really sad actually, because the students always knock on my door. I try to be one of the professors that has always got an ear for my students, and in the past I've been dealing a lot with academic issues, but much more recently there's been issues that have been around pressures and stresses and strains a lot more. And the consistent theme is that they're just terrified of failure. They're terrified of what they've scored and what the feedback's going to say. So, some of them are so paralyzed by failure they can't even open it. They just can't bring themselves to open their grade because they just don't want to expose themselves to the emotions that they've happened to have failed. Because I guess they've learned from experience that those things are really, really hard to deal with. And I just think that's so sad. And one of the things that I think is really important is as you've just said there, is to really, and this is what I try and tell my students, is to try to reframe that as failure as something that's very humanizing, right? We're fallible human beings. We're imperfect human beings. We're mere mortals. And we're going to fail way more than we're going to succeed. Failure is a statistical probability. It's just regression to the mean. It's a natural and very humanizing experience. And instead of seeing it as something that's catastrophic, if we can see it as something that's a reminder, I guess, of our beautiful fallibility, I think that's an important thing to say. And I think also what's important is there's a lot of push on young people to recycle failure into growth. You see this a lot, right? Okay, so if you fail, you got to learn, you got to develop. And I just want to tell students, just let them have failure. Let them have it. Like, don't continually teach young people to recycle their failure into success, right? And use it as almost currency to trade in for a better hand. Just let young people fail. And let them experience the emotions and the anxieties and the worries and the stresses that come for those failures. Let them sit with it. Let those emotions wash through them. As I said, as a reminder of what it means to be human, right? So I think failure, as you mentioned, is such an important part of this. And if we can really just, I guess, quite radically, I suppose, redefine what failure means, I think that will go a great deal to reducing some of the pressures that young people feel around perfection.
All right, we have to stop there. We have great gratitude to Thomas Curran, Assistant Professor of Psychological and Behavioral Science at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He studies perfectionism. We're going to take a break. We're going to come back after this. All right, so I think we just had a technical problem, which is very appropriate on our show about perfectionism and the evils of perfectionism. Got to thank Kat Pastor, she's our technical producer, and Lily Tyson, senior producer of the Colin McEnroe Show, producer of this particular episode. We're going to end our conversation here with Kristen Meinzer, an author and host of many podcasts, including By the Book, where she reads self-help books and lives by their rules for 2 weeks. Welcome to our show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I think it might be helpful just to maybe begin with an example of this. And my understanding is that one of the ones that you did this with that was kind of challenging was a book I personally had never heard of, had to look up. It's called Atomic Habits. Tell us about that and what it was like to try to live with that.
Oh, that was such a challenge for me because the whole premise of the book is that we should aim to be better every single day and that we should track all of our behaviors and at the end of the day categorize those behaviors as good, bad, or neutral. And so it really, for me, set up a set of standards that I'm never good enough as I am. I should always aim for more, that everything fell into a good, bad binary. And that's not really the way life is. But sadly, that's the way a lot of self-help books are. They really try to eliminate complicated feelings, things that make the world feel richer and fuller, and instead focus exclusively on how to be more productive, how to be happier, how to be wealthier, how to be more efficient. And that kind of binary just doesn't work well for most humans. And sadly, it's really what most self-help books are shilling.
Yeah, I think, for most of us, for example, I don't think of myself as a perfectionist. I'm pretty sure I'm not one. I might have been one earlier in my life. But I do still have that little voice inside my head that will say, you're not well enough prepared. You should have done more. And you're heading into this thing. You could have been better. You could do this a little bit better. And I feel like you need a little of that little self-critiquing voice that says, do a little bit more, push a little bit harder, don't get overconfident. But I think we already have that. And you sort of wonder, well, let me just ask you, you should have some kind of detachment when you do these exercises, when you try to live by one of these books. But it sounds like it got in your head anyway.
Yeah, at this point, I've lived by the rules of approximately 80 self-help books, I think it is. And 2 weeks at a time, following every single rule down to the letter, even, things that are in the fine print that other people may not be seeing in the books. I am doing all of those things. And you would think I would lighten up a bit about it, but because I really believe in the importance of being, a guinea pig, of really being the test kitchen for these books, of examining the messages they're sending to people. I really believe so strongly in the mission of our show to, pull back the curtain on where's the sexism, where's the racism in this, where's the classism. So many of these self-help books are about classism and about never being good enough. And so I really do my best to live by the process. And unfortunately, that does mean from time to time, they do get into my head, and especially if they are tapping into something that has in the past been a problem for me, like perfectionism. So it can be really tough.
I mean, one thing that came out of this, I think, was your own self-help book about self-help, right? Called How to Be Fine?
Yes. And we very purposely titled the book How to Be Fine in contrast to what other self-help books are promising, because most of them are making promises that are just impossible to deliver on. And what we wanted to do in our book is just look at what are some of the things that were valuable that we took away from self-help books? What are some of the things that were not valuable, that were probably dangerous for a lot of people? And what do we wish more self-help books would say? And a lot of the things we were getting at were that nobody who is writing a self-help book is more of an expert in you than you. They have never met you. They have not sat down with you. Over 2/3 of self-help authors are men, and over 2/3 of the readers are women. So it is an industry of men telling women what is wrong with them, telling them what to fix. And it is also an industry filled with people who were born on third base saying, if I can do it, anyone can. Well, is that really true? Can I do what you did when you were born upper middle class, white, male, straight, well connected enough to get a book deal by your 30th birthday? Then no. Why should I be following you off the cliff when what you're promising doesn't even apply to who I am as a person in this world?
It seems that there's so much messaging in our society about this. I talked earlier in the show about just the way that figure skating and gymnastics have become the most popular Olympic sports, and they require certain kinds of body types and a certain commitment to perfection and elimination of even minor kinds of errors. I think we see it on television, although increasingly some of the lessons from The Dropout or Inventing Anna are don't try to be too perfect because you'll go nuts and you'll become a sociopath. But I'm just also wondering, is there – you said that in your book there are at least some of the good lessons from some of these self-help books. Can you maybe mention one of them?
Yeah. So one of the self-help books I loved living by was called The Art of Dying Well. And in that book, it's doing something that most self-help books won't do, which is dealing with painful and complicated feelings. And the book is not promising, oh, I'm going to make you the happiest you'll ever be when somebody you love dies. The book is not promising that. It's talking about how do we deal with tough feelings? How do we make things easier for those we leave behind when we ourselves die? How do we live our lives in a way that our values are front and center now so that whoever's writing an obituary for us later actually sees while we're alive what we believe in. And so there absolutely are some books out there that do try to go against the grain with regard to living our best life. And that was one of them. Living our best life in some cases means preparing for death, which most Americans will not do. We're so scared of death in America. That was one of them. And then I also have to say, I really loved Dolly Parton's book, Dream dream more. In her book, what she's essentially doing is saying from the get-go, I'm not trying to tell you what to do. I'm just telling you 4 wishes I have for you. These are things I wished for myself, things that I put into practice in my own life. And I hope that you can consider these wishes I have for you. I wish that you dream more. I wish that you're kinder, and so on. And I think that is such a great model for a book. It's not starting off with the model of here's something wrong with you. Here's how you fix it. This is why you're going to be a failure if you aren't sleeping better or richer or thinner at the end of this book. The book instead is really just imparting, a story with wishes. And I think that's such a great model for a book.
We're almost out of time here, and I apologize for that. But Kristen Meinzer, one of the words that kind of exists now in a way that it didn't, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 or 20 years ago, is optimization. This is now starting to be called an optimization movement. I don't know, help people understand what that means and why we might be a little bit wary of it.
Oh my gosh, optimization. It's really about life hacking, being the most, better, faster, more productive. It's about everything can essentially be monetized, optimized. I just repeated optimized. But it really is a model that we can't just live life and make mistakes and have fun. What if I just want to garden and I'm not good at gardening? What if none of my things in my garden are worthy of an Instagram feed or selling at the farmer's market? Can't I just enjoy that? Can't I just enjoy the experience of watering my tomatoes that are not flourishing? And maybe I don't need to optimize that. And I feel that in the world we live in now, we're not really allowing a lot of space for people to have those moments of just enjoying our bad tomatoes. And I say, if something's worth doing, it's worth doing badly sometimes. That's not something that I invented, by the way. Other therapists and, people have said that before, but most of us are getting the message our whole lives. If it's worth doing well. But maybe we should all abandon that and maybe say it's okay to do things badly, and maybe life is richer and more fun and more interesting when we don't try to be perfect about everything.
I sense about 5 book titles for your future books in there, including Enjoy Your Bad Tomatoes. Kristen Meinzer, thanks so much for talking to us. Her podcasts include By the Book, where she reads help books and lives by their rules for 2 weeks. We're going to go into an actual fundraising break. Our philosophy here, this is really true, is we try to do an amazing show that's different from all other public radio shows, and then we learn to live with failure within that model. So as these nice people come on and ask you to support us, please do.
Yes.